Detective Elliot Ellroy stood in the narrow hallway of the Fernridge Motel, facing room 12C. The wallpaper peeled like old bark, and the hum of a vending machine buzzed somewhere down the corridor. A housekeeping cart sat abandoned nearby, one wheel turned sideways. The officer beside him broke the silence. "Called it in as a suicide," he said, pushing the door open with a gloved hand. "But something about it feels wrong." The wind swept down through the pine ridges of Oak Ridge, Oregon, cutting through the November chill like a blade. Rain fell in soft sheets, soaking the pavement outside the Ellroy home, a modest, two-storm structure nestled just off Lakeview Road. Inside, the smell of old coffee lingered in the kitchen, long gone cold in the pot. Dana Ellroy stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the driveway, her hands tight around a mug she hadn't sipped from in over an hour. The house was quiet, too quiet. Normally, her husband's voice would echo down the hall about now, grumbling over paperwork or muttering at the evening news. But tonight, the only sound was the hum of the fridge and the faint creak of the old wood floor beneath her feet. At 6:17 p.m., Martin Ellroy had called her from a payphone near the precinct. His voice had been steady, but Dana noticed the edge, subtle, but there. He'd said one thing before hanging up. "If I don't make it home tonight, Dana, it means something big is happening. Don't call the station, just wait for my call." Then he was gone. Martin was a senior investigator nearing 48, respected, even feared within the Oak Ridge Police Department. He had built a career on chasing corruption, and lately he'd been working a case no one else wanted, internal misconduct at the department's highest levels. Dana had warned him, even pleaded with him, to let it go. "Just retire, take the pension, come home," she'd said. "They're not going to let you clean up a system that doesn't want to be cleaned." But Martin had always been stubborn. "You don't stop digging because it's dangerous," he'd told her once. "You stop when you hit the truth." That night, Dana didn't sleep. She called the precinct 3 times. Each time, she was told Martin hadn't checked back in. By morning, she drove there herself. No one looked her in the eye. Captain Rowden told her they were doing all they could. His voice was polite, but hollow. And the implication was clear. Martin had walked into the woods and not come out. By the 3rd day, search crews were sent into the surrounding national forest, the same trails Martin had reportedly investigated near the Hollow Pines perimeter, a closed-off logging site where county infrastructure records had mysteriously disappeared years earlier. They found nothing, not a shred of clothing, not a broken branch, not a sign of struggle. Just silence. But Dana never believed the official story, not even for a moment, not after what showed up at her doorstep on the 4th morning. It was a plain brown envelope, no return address, no postage stamp. It had been slipped into her mailbox sometime in the night. Inside was Martin's watch, the same titanium Hamilton field watch she'd given him on their 10th anniversary. It was still ticking. Dana collapsed into the kitchen chair, trembling. She stared at the watch for hours. Martin never took it off, never. And if this had been found in the woods, it wouldn't be clean. It wouldn't be ticking. Someone had sent it, someone who wanted her to know he was gone, but not lost. The police dismissed it as a prank, said it could have been dropped years ago and someone found it. Dana didn't argue. She simply stopped going to them. She printed missing person flyers on her own, hired a private investigator with what little savings they had left, and began building her own wall of evidence. Dates, calls, locations, photos. Most of it led nowhere, but the pattern was clear. Martin hadn't vanished, he'd been erased. Weeks became months. Months stretched into years. By the time 1992 rolled around, Martin's case had been officially closed. The report cited high likelihood of accidental disappearance, presumed deceased. The forest had swallowed him, they said. End of story. Dana kept the envelope and the watch. Every year on the anniversary of his disappearance, she wound it manually, just to keep it alive. Their son, Elliot, was just 5 when his father vanished. At the time, he didn't understand the gravity, only the absence. He would ask where his dad had gone, and Dana would lie gently, "He's on a long case, sweetheart." As Elliot grew, the lie became a silence between them. Something neither of them spoke about, but both carried like a shadow. Elliot grew into his father's image, tall, deliberate, with the same wary eyes. By the time he turned 35, he was a detective too, working narcotics and organized crime in Portland. He hadn't spoken of his father's case in nearly a decade, but the file was still there, locked in the bottom drawer of his apartment desk, sealed in a red folder, worn at the edges. What Dana didn't know, what no one did, was that Elliot had never truly let it go. Every few years he'd reopen the investigation on his own time, call in old contacts, dig through police archives, re-interview names. Each time he'd hit a dead end. Until 2021, when a routine call came in about a suicide at a rundown motel outside Oak Ridge. A former officer, Simon Rourke, the name meant little to anyone at the station. But to Elliot, it rang like a bell in a quiet room. Rourke had served with his father, and when Elliot arrived at that motel, saw the angle of the gun, the placement of the blood, something in him shifted. The room didn't look like a man who wanted to die. It looked like a man who'd run out of time. And beneath the dead man's body, in a sealed envelope marked only with the initials MLM, was a photo. 3 men. One of them unmistakably Martin Ellroy. The room reeked of old cigarettes and mildew, the kind of smell that clung to wallpaper and soaked into the carpet like regret. Elliot stood just inside the threshold of room 12 at the Mariner's Rest Motel, one gloved hand resting on his hip while the other held up a thin beam of flashlight across the cluttered space. The overhead bulb flickered weakly, casting the edges of the room in pulsing shadows. The body on the floor belonged to Simon Rourke, a name Elliot hadn't heard since he was 12. Former patrol sergeant, retired early due to a nervous condition, then disappeared off the radar completely. Until now. He was sprawled across the stained carpet, dressed in worn slacks and a flannel shirt, the revolver still cradled loosely in his right hand. At first glance, the scene screamed suicide. No forced entry, gunshot wound to the head, note on the nightstand. Open and shut. But Elliot didn't trust easy conclusions. His father had taught him better than that. He moved closer, crouching to examine the dried pool of blood. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. The largest stain was centered around the body, sure, but there was a separate smear almost a meter away, near the base of the kitchenette counter. It was as if someone had bled there first, then moved, or been moved. Elliot reached for the forensic markers in his kit and tagged the spot silently. His eyes scanned the rest of the room. Nothing was obviously disturbed, no broken glass, no signs of a struggle, but the layout felt off, like someone had tidied up, but not with real care. He rose and turned to the nightstand. The suicide note lay beneath a half-empty bottle of generic whiskey. The handwriting was uneven, shaky. "I'm sorry," it read. "I couldn't live with it anymore." That was it. No names, no confession, no details. Just a vague cry into the void. Elliot took a photo and bagged the note. Back at the precinct, as the ME began processing Rourke's body, Elliot requested access to the man's personal effects. The front desk clerk had said Rourke had been staying at the motel for 3 weeks under his own name, paying cash every 3 days. In his wallet were $37, a veteran's medical ID, and a faded family photo. But tucked into the inner pocket of his jacket was something else, a smaller, curled-up photograph nearly stuck to the lining from age and moisture. Elliot carefully pried it loose. The edges were cracked, the colors sun-faded, but the image itself was clear enough. 3 men in uniform standing in front of a pine forest, the trees tall and clustered tightly behind them. The photo was dated, in the corner, July 14, 1998. The man on the left was unmistakably Rourke, younger but already weathered, his smirk off-center like he knew a joke no one else did. The man on the right was someone Elliot didn't recognize, tall, clean-shaven, just as the shutter clicked. The image was the man in the middle who made Elliot's throat tighten. The image was slightly blurred, like the subject had shifted just as the shutter clicked. But the posture, the build, even the slant of the shoulders was familiar, very familiar. Elliot's fingers trembled slightly as he brought the photo closer. He knew that stance. He'd seen it in birthday pictures, in framed graduation day smiles, in the one wedding photo his mother still kept in the attic. It looked like his father. Martin Ellroy, but it couldn't be. Martin had disappeared in 1991. This photo was marked 7 years later. Elliot stared at the image for a long time before sliding it into a protective sleeve. He didn't speak to anyone about it, not yet. At home that night, he sat at his desk in silence, the photo placed carefully in front of him, the watch his mother had kept sitting beside it. He pulled out his father's case file from the drawer, flipping through yellowed pages and brittle notes. All officially concluded, all useless. Something had always felt wrong about how it ended, how quickly the department moved on, how little they let his mother know. But now, with this picture in hand, there was proof, or something like it. Proof that Martin hadn't vanished into the woods in 1991. Proof that he might have come back, or never left. The next morning, Elliot went back to the Mariner's Rest and asked to see the security footage. The desk clerk shrugged, said the cameras hadn't worked in months. Elliot took a copy of the guest log instead. There was no record of visitors during Rourke's stay, but something about that felt staged too. He called for the lab results on the blood smear. The DNA came back inclusive, due to confirm it's Rourke. That meant one of two things. Either Rourke had been bleeding before he died and somehow moved across the room, or someone else had been injured there. The pieces didn't fit. A fake-looking suicide, a decades-old photo that shouldn't exist, and a blood trail leading nowhere. And now, a growing unease began to settle into Elliot's chest. He reopened the suicide note and studied the final sentence again. I couldn't live with it anymore. What was it? Guilt? Fear? A secret? He needed to know more. He pulled Rourke's old personnel file from archives. Buried in the incident reports was a suspension from 1990, involuntary administrative leave due to failure to report internal misconduct. No further details. Elliot requested the original documentation, but it was listed as destroyed, red flag, and when he asked around, most of the older detectives responded the same way. No work? Bit of a lone wolf? Never talked much? Had demon. But no one remembered specifics. Then, late one evening, as Elliot was sorting through Rourke's remaining possessions, stored in a small cardboard box from the ME's office, he found it. A key, old, brass, tagged with a number and the word Hollow. He recognized that name. Hollow Pines, the same location listed in his father's final notes, the same remote area where Martin had reportedly disappeared 30 years ago. Rourke had been there, which raised a chilling possibility. Maybe Martin had never left, and maybe Rourke had seen him again, long after 1991. Elliot sat alone in the Municipal Records Archive, the whir of the microfilm machine humming softly under flickering fluorescent lights. He was deep inside the basement of the Oak Ridge Municipal Annex, buried beneath 30 years of dust, water-stained folders, and bureaucratic apathy. The box in front of him was labeled LOA 8519-8519-19, and inside, time was preserved like dried leaves trapped in amber. He thumbed through faded incident reports, typed memos, and handwritten notes in his father's precise block script. Most of it was routine. Traffic logs, narcotic summaries, departmental memos, until he came across a thin manila folder with no label, paper-clipped shut. Inside were 3 sheets. The first, a topographic map of southern Lane County. The second, a typed report on an arson case from 1985 involving a lumber mill on the outskirts of a now-defunct settlement known as Hollow Pines. And the third, a handwritten note from Martin himself, dated March 1990, reading simply, "Hollow the money." The note was underlined in red. Elliot squinted at the map. Hollow Pines was located deep in a forested basin, accessible only by a gravel fire road that hadn't been maintained since Reagan was in office. According to the arson report, the mill had burned overnight. No casualties, no suspects, case closed. But attached to the back of the file was a 4th sheet, stamped "Confidential" in a faded red ink, with a county clerk's seal dated June 1997. 6 years after Martin had disappeared. It detailed a property transfer and listed several wire transactions routed through a shell LLC called Merritt Holdings. The listed address for Merritt Holdings was a P.O. box in Eugene, Oregon. But what chilled Elliot was the location listed under Asset Maintenance, quietly, and used it for financial movement long after the public thought it abandoned. He leaned back in the chair, heart thudding steadily, not from fear, but from the sudden momentum of connection. His father had been right. Something happened out there, something someone tried very hard to erase, and if those transactions were real, it meant the land had value, operational, strategic, or worse. Elliot requested the full file on Merit Holdings from county records, but was told it had been expunged due to inactivity. That phrase again: expunged, removed, erased. Too many missing pieces. He shifted focus to Simon Rourke. If Rourke had kept the key labeled hollow, it meant he had access, or had been there recently. Digging into Rourke's history proved difficult. His personnel file was threadbare: routine commendations, early retirement, nothing explosive. But buried in the disciplinary archive was a flagged incident from 1990, sealed due to insufficient evidence. Elliot filed a formal request and waited. When it arrived 2 days later, most of the content had been redacted, but one thing stood out: a complaint of evidence tampering during a major narcotics bust. A kilo of heroin had gone missing from the evidence room, and Rourke had been the last person to log in that night. No charges were filed, but the investigator who filed the internal complaint was none other than Martin Ellroy. There it was, the connection. Martin had begun to suspect something, and someone, inside his own department, and Rourke had been part of it. Digging deeper, Elliot found the original complaint form, photocopied poorly and yellowed with time. In the margin, Martin had scribbled a single name repeatedly, circling it each time in fading black ink: Richard Vane. The name meant nothing at first. Elliot searched the database: no known criminal history, no registered citizen in Lake County under that name, no former employee. He checked utility bills, business licenses, arrest records. Nothing. A ghost. But the name kept appearing in disconnected fragments: an unsigned land lease from 1994 tied to Hollow Pines, a background mention in a financial audit involving misappropriated police pension funds in 1996, and, strangely, a reference in an email chain from an old detective's retirement roast, where someone jokingly wrote, "Vane was always 2 steps ahead, even when he wasn't real." Elliot printed every instance. He pinned them across a board in his apartment, red thread linking each reference. If Richard Vane wasn't real, then he was either a code name or someone very powerful had worked hard to scrub his tracks. He revisited the photo from Rourke's coat. 3 men, 3 connections. Rourke was dead. The man on the right, still unidentified, the one in the center, possibly Martin, looked not only alive in that photo, but standing comfortably between them. Not a prisoner, not a target. One of them. Elliot felt the air tighten in his lungs. What if Martin hadn't just stumbled into something dangerous? What if he'd joined it? That night, he reopened his father's old field notebooks. In the final entry from April 1991, Martin had written, "Truth's not hidden. It's buried. Hollow Pines. Vane. They'll come for me if I get too close. But if someone finds this, keep going." Elliot rubbed his forehead, mind reeling. The initials, RV, kept flashing through his thoughts. Rourke, Vane, recurring villains or sacrificial pawns. He returned to the station and pulled the 1997 transaction sheet again. One of the listed routing accounts belonged to a regional construction firm called Darrow & Vane Development. The paperwork listed only one active executive, R. Vane. No photo, no personal details, only a tax ID number that, when traced, linked back to a defunct burial transport business based in southern Idaho. Another dead end. Unless it wasn't. Elliot filed an interagency request for any federal case files involving Darrow and Vane. While waiting for approval, he drove back to Hollow Pines. This time, he wasn't just curious, he was hunting. The rain had returned to Oak Ridge by the time Elliot stood on the uneven porch of a weather-beaten yellow duplex just off Maple Grove. The house sagged slightly in the middle, like it had grown tired of standing. He knocked twice, then once more, out of habit. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and a tired-looking woman peered out. Linda Rourke hadn't aged kindly. Her skin bore the brittle wear of old grief in long days, and her voice was cautious as she asked, "You're the one who found Simon?" Elliot nodded. "I need to ask you some questions, Mrs. Rourke. It's about your husband and someone named Richard Vane." At the mention of the name, her expression froze, not in recognition, but in confirmation. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside. The inside of the house was cluttered but clean, filled with old books, faded photographs, and a silence that felt settled rather than awkward. She poured tea without asking and set it down in front of him, then sat across the table with a long breath. "Simon said someone would come eventually," she said, voice low. "He didn't say when, only that when they did, I'd know by the name they asked about. Richard Vane." She reached into a kitchen drawer and pulled out a thin envelope, yellowed with age, but sealed with a piece of black wax. "He told me to give this only if someone mentioned that name. He made me promise." Elliot took the envelope gently, studying it for a moment before carefully breaking the seal. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a typewritten letter, unsigned, dated August 14, 2002. It made vague references to asset transfers, continuity planning, and shielding identities. The second document was far more revealing, a notarized land transfer assigning control of a 62-acre plot near Birch Hollow to a man named Frederick Mann. The transfer had been authorized under Oregon state deed law with a certified signature at the bottom in bold, slanted cursive. But Elliot didn't need a forensic team to recognize that signature. He had seen it dozens of times, on report cards, birthday cards, and a framed commendation letter his mother had kept, even after all the pain. It was Martin Ellroy's handwriting. He sat in stunned silence, holding the page like it might burn through his fingers. Linda watched him without speaking. After a long moment, Elliot asked, "Do you know who Frederick Mann really is?" Linda shook her head. "I only know Simon used to whisper that name at night sometimes, like it haunted him. He told me once, years ago, that Mann wasn't a man, he was a door." Whatever that meant. Elliot nodded slowly, folding the paper and sliding it into a protective sleeve from his bag. "It means my father didn't die in 1991. He changed names. Hid in plain sight." Back at the station, Elliot returned to the records room. He pulled archived signature logs from his father's service record, comparing the 1991 forms to the 2002 land transfer. The loop of the M, the angled pressure on the final Y, even the idiosyncratic way he crossed his it. It was identical. He scanned the signature into the analysis software used in handwriting verification and ran a comparison. The system responded in under a minute, 97.8% match. A match that tight over an 11-year gap was beyond coincidence. He sat back in the chair, the reality sinking deeper. Martin hadn't just disappeared. He had rebranded, created a new identity, and continued to function, likely with intent, not accident. And if he had gone through the trouble of setting up a new legal persona, that meant he was preparing for longevity. But why Mann? Why that land? He returned to the deed form and saw something small but crucial, an embedded clause referencing a trust named Oxbow Limited, a dummy corporation Elliot hadn't encountered before. A quick search turned up nothing, no website, no filings. But buried in an SAS leak database from 5 years earlier, Elliot found a flagged trust by the same name, tied to a series of land acquisitions in remote rural areas, all transferred through proxies with no visible links, except one. A small legal firm in Medford, Oregon, operated by someone named Lauren Vane. The pieces tilted slightly again. Vane wasn't just a myth. He, or someone using that name, was part of a legal framework, a structure meant to hide money, people, and purpose. Elliot filed a request for access to Vane's legal filings and began tracing known affiliates of Oxbow Limited. One name pinged against a low parental surveillance log from 2009, someone listed as M. Ellison, who had once appeared as a silent partner in a warehouse conversion project near Coos Bay. The timestamp on that file was 2003, same year the Frederick Mann deed had gone through. He drove straight to the Office of Real Estate Archives the next day and requested physical copies of the transaction records. The woman behind the desk, after some coaxing, let him access a locked cabinet labeled Archived Anomalies. Inside was a ledger, handwritten, listing the transfer of Birch Hollow property to Frederick Mann. But scrawled in the notes section, barely legible in fading pencil, was a brief phrase. There it was, the connector. Whoever Vane was, he had been there, in the room, watching the signature that gave a new life to a man the world believed dead. Elliot closed the ledger carefully and stood still for a long moment. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and he felt the world narrow. The lines between his father's life and his own had blurred, overlapped, and now twisted back toward a past no longer theoretical. He wasn't just chasing a ghost anymore. He was walking in the footprints of someone who had built his vanishing act with surgical precision. And now, the question that mattered most wasn't whether Martin Ellroy was still alive. It was what he had become. The forest had grown thicker since the map was drawn, the gravel fire road now barely wide enough for Elliot's cruiser to squeeze through without scraping both mirrors. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Detective Mara Tierney, his field partner from Portland, who had only recently been briefed on the full depth of the investigation. She said little as they drove, flipping through the printed lease document under the name Frederick Mann. "You sure about this?" she finally asked. Elliot nodded, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "If what we're chasing leads anywhere, it leads here." The trees gave way suddenly to a sunken clearing half swallowed by brush and fallen pine. The air felt heavier, as if history had settled over the place like a weighted shroud. Vines clung to its walls. The ground around it was uneven, but something in the center drew Elliot's attention. A circular patch of gravel. Too clean, too deliberate. They split up, checking the perimeter for any signs of habitation, but the area was long abandoned. No power lines, no fresh tire tracks, just the occasional sign of small wildlife and time. Back at the center, Mar crouched beside the gravel patch and tapped it twice with her knuckle. A dull thud echoed. "This isn't just foundation," she said. "Help me clear it?" Together, they pulled away loose stones, revealing a rusted iron plat with a ring handle. It took both of them to pry it open, hinges screaming in protest as stale, musty air billowed out from the darkness below. A narrow wooden ladder descended into black. Elliot went first, flashlight held steady, his other hand gripping the rungs. The space was small, no more than 12 feet across, and the air thick with rot and mildew. Along one wall sat a metal cabinet, the door half open. In the corner, an old cot sagged under mold-stained sheets. Beside it, a crate of rusted weapons, mostly handguns, a shotgun, 2 combat knives. What drew his eye, though, was the bundle of folders in a plastic tub, carefully sealed, organized by year. He knelt, lifting the top one. Inside were police files, real but not filed through official systems. Notes on officers, investigations, internal memos. Some with red classified stamps, others marked with initials that no longer matched anyone active on the force. Then, between 2 files, a rectangular piece of charred plastic with a melted corner. Elliot lifted it carefully. It was a badge. The number was half gone, but the nameplate read clearly through the soot. Martin Ellroy. The plastic had warped, but the metal seal was intact. He turned it over in his hand. This wasn't something planted to throw off suspicion. This had been left behind, forgotten or abandoned. His father had been here, and, judging by the dust, it hadn't been in years. Mara called him over to the far wall, where she'd found bloodstains, dried, dark but significant. A smear led from a support beam to a corner where a second cot frame had collapsed in on itself. No sign of a body, no obvious trauma to the structure, just the blood. They collected a sample. Back at the station, Elliot processed it through the department lab under priority status. 2 days later, the results came in, partial match to a known profile in old department DNA, Clarence Hale. Elliot stared at the name. Clarence Hale had gone missing in the spring of 1991, just months before Martin disappeared. At the time, it had been classified as a field accident. His cruiser had reportedly gone off the road near a ravine during a pursuit. No body ever found. The report was written by Martin himself. Elliot pulled the report again. This time he read every line, looking for contradictions. The descriptions were oddly vague. No weather conditions noted, no time of day logged, no call record of the pursuit itself. But the signature at the bottom, same sharp-angled slant, same curl of the... Martin had filed it. Back in the bunker, Elliot and Mara continued combing through the files. They found references to hollow pines in multiple memos, some coded with initials and numbers, others pointing to departments within the city that no longer existed. One folder contained photographs, blurry surveillance images taken from high angles. People meeting near vehicles, some exchanging boxes, others just talking. One of the figures bore a familiar frame, thicker around the shoulders, posture rigid. The face was never clear, but the presence was undeniable. Whoever took these photos had been documenting activity that no one ever reported. And then they found a locked drawer beneath the cat frame. Inside, carefully wrapped in wax paper, were 3 cassette tapes and a bound journal. Elliot flipped through the journal quickly. Most of it was shorthand he didn't recognize, but a few full sentences stood out. Hale wasn't supposed to ask questions. Vane said to isolate the incident. "They'll bury me if this leaks." The last page simply read, "I only became a ghost because they were better at it." Mara looked at him, concerned. "Your dad didn't just disappear. He orchestrated something structured." Elliot nodded, his mind replaying old memories, not of his father vanishing, but of his silence in the months before. The late-night pacing, the way he'd stop mid-sentence sometimes, like calculating what could or couldn't be said. At the time, Elliot had thought it was stress. Now he wondered if it had been guilt. They ran prints found on the cabinet and drawer. Most were degraded, but one partial matched Clarence Hale again. The implication was stark. Hale hadn't died in an accident. He'd been here, bleeding, maybe dying, and his last trace had been buried beneath layers of lies, inside a site no one had touched in decades. Elliot stared at the wall, eyes fixed on the pattern of documents pinned above the cot. One photo showed what looked like a crude map, intersections, initials, red lines drawn with force. It wasn't just a hideout. It had been a planning site, a war room. And the war, it seemed, had started a long time ago. The office lights buzzed faintly overhead as Elliot scrolled through financial documents, his eyes scanning columns of transaction logs that stretched back more than 20 years. The trail began with Mann & Co., the front company tied to the land deed under the alias Frederick Mann, and extended like a spiderweb through half a dozen seemingly unrelated businesses. Blue Ridge Freight, Horizon Mutual Insurance, Tripine Logistics, and finally a modest but surprisingly profitable mortuary firm named Silver Grace Memorial Services. On the surface, nothing connected them different. Different differences, different boards of directors, even different cities. But buried in the transfer history, Elliot noticed a pattern. Identical routing numbers, staggered cash inflow flows, and a shared P.O. box in Salem, Oregon, used for federal tax filings. It was too clean, too consistent, a laundering loop hidden beneath legitimate commerce. He tagged the pattern and ran it through the Bureau's fraud detection framework. The results lit up like a warning flare. Several large deposits had passed through the mortuary company during the months following 3 separate, closed case deaths. Cases listed as solved with minimal investigation, each with an abrupt drop in departmental attention. A former city councilman, a mid-level narcotics officer, and a private investigator who had once filed complaints against the Oak Ridge PD. All buried under suspicious but unchallenged circumstances. All handled by Silver Grace Memorial, and in each, the death certificates were filed by the same attending coroner, Dr. Alan Vechner, now retired and unreachable. Elliot printed the reports, pinning them to the expanding board in his office. Mara stepped in, 2 coffees in hand, and read over his shoulder. "Let me guess, they all used Mann & Co. for the real estate paperwork?" Elliot nodded. "And they all funneled money through the same insurance underwriter tied to Blue Ridge Freight. It's a laundering circuit, legal on the surface, but internally it's a skeleton factory." He paused, his voice tightening. "And I think my father built it." The next piece came unexpectedly, through a response from the State Records Archive. Elliot had submitted a request for any official documentation involving Clarence Hale, hoping to corroborate the DNA hit from the hidden bunker. The envelope arrived by mail, sealed, stamped, marked with a confidentiality disclaimer. A cause: vehicle impact trauma, presumed accidental. Location of death: Route 47, east of Hollow Pines. Place of burial: Laurel Hill Cemetery, Lane County. But the shock came from the final field. The prefix signature, Lanham/official, signature. The name printed clearly in blue ink was Martin Ellroy. Elliot stared at the line for a full minute, heart pounding in his chest. His father had gone missing in May 1991. The certificate was signed in June. According to all official records, Martin had vanished into the forest and never returned. Yet here he was, signing off on a death report weeks later like nothing had happened. He checked the file again. The signature was authentic, verified by notary, and filed through the city coroner's office. He drove to Laurel Hill that afternoon. The cemetery was quiet, tucked behind a veil of sycamores and wrought iron fencing. He found the section easily. Row C, Plot 102. The headstone read, Clarence J. Hale, 194919919. But something was off. The soil beneath the marker was slightly sunken, as if it had been disturbed years after the original burial. Elliot requested a ground scan. The tech team confirmed his suspicion. The coffin was there, but light. Too light. No. Skeletal density, no remains. He ordered the grave exhumed. The coffin was opened under supervision. Inside was a bundle of sandbags wrapped in canvas. No body. No trace of DNA. A decoy burial. Someone had planted weight, sealed the casket, and filed it under official channels. The burial was a sham, a performance with documentation. The death certificate, now in his hand, wasn't just a lie. It was a key to understanding how deep the corruption had run. Elliot filed for access to all death certificates signed by Martin within the 2 months surrounding his disappearance. Only 2 others existed, one for an unnamed transient male found near the Pine Ridge train yard, cause of death, cardiac arrest, no family, cremated within 48 hours. The second for a man named Carter Lowndes, who'd reportedly died of blunt force trauma in a domestic dispute. No suspects ever charged, both cases closed, both bodies handled by Silver Grace Memorial. He cross-referenced the timestamps. In each case, the coroner's report had been submitted within 2 days, filed without request for autopsy, and signed off by supervisors who no longer worked in the county. He dug deeper, requesting employment records and termination files. 3 names stood out, officers who had left the force within months of Martin's disappearance, each under personal leave or early retirement. All 3 now lived out of state, and 2 were unreachable. He turned his focus to the coroner, Dr. Vechner. A little digging revealed he'd moved to Arizona in 2005, changed his phone number twice, and had recently sold property under a silent partnership with a company named Redward Transfer Holdings, yet another business tied to the financial shell chain from Mann & Co. Elliot could feel the tension rising in his shoulders. Every layer he peeled back revealed a new one underneath. It was like trying to drain a swamp through a straw. He pinned a new cluster to the board. Photos of Hale, Martin's signature on the certificate, financial maps, coroner profiles, decoy burials. A complete shadow infrastructure. This wasn't just a rogue operation. It was institutionalized misdirection. Deaths falsified, burials staged, evidence suppressed or manufactured, and his father, who was supposed to have been a casualty, had been the architect, perhaps even the director. As the pieces aligned, one name began to rise above the others, like a watermark bleeding through paper. Richard Vane. Always referenced, never seen. Tied to leases, notaries, account openings. The name wasn't on the death certificates, but the routing numbers from the insurance claims all pointed back to a central fund, one registered to RV Holdings. Elliot ran a corporate identity trace. The address came back to a vacant warehouse off I-5, long abandoned, its original tenant listed as Ridge Park Burial Logistics, a transport company technically legal but connected to no known vehicles, with a fleet that hadn't been reported in any state database for over a decade. Mara stepped in as he finished his trace, phone in hand. "You need to see this," she said, voice low. "Found something else." She held out a screenshot, an email fragment pulled from an archived police communications log dated August 1991. The subject line read, "Final clearance approved." The sender? An alias email ending in @ridgeparklog.com. The recipient's name had been redacted, but the last visible line in the body read, "As always, F. Mann will handle the burial." The warehouse at Lake Marlow had once stored industrial piping and construction aggregates for the county's largest civil works contractor, but now it stood quiet, windows smashed, steel support beams rusting beneath the coastal fog. It was the kind of place where things went to be forgotten, including the truth. Elliot parked his unmarked car 2 blocks away, careful to keep the vehicle out of view. His hands were steady, but beneath the calm his pulse drummed like distant thunder. 3 nights ago, he had reactivated a dormant credit card registered under Oxbow Limited, a financial shell connected to Mann & Co. It hadn't been used since 2004, but within 18 hours of that card being swiped at a gas station in Ashland, a background ping triggered a location query routed through a fire pool Elliot recognized from Ridge Park Burial Logistics. It was bait, and someone had bitten. He crossed the cracked concrete floor of the warehouse, the soles of his boots crunching over broken glass. A shaft of weak sunlight filtered through a jagged hole in the roof, spotlighting old scaffolding and empty crates. At the far end, beneath the catwalk, a single figure stood partially in shadow. The man didn't move as Elliot approached. Dark hair, he wasn't armed, at least not visibly. "You've grown," the man said quietly, voice older but unmistakable. Elliot froze, breath catching in his throat. The last time he'd heard that voice, it had been over a phone line 30 years earlier. "You're supposed to be dead," Elliot said. The man, Martin Ellroy, stepped forward into the light. His face was warm, weathered by years of living behind names that weren't his, but the eyes were the same, coldly analytical. "So were you, at least according to some of my files." Elliot didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. For a moment, the air between them was filled only by silence and the distant sound of wind whistling through broken rafters. Martin's gaze swept over him. "You found the bunker?" Elliot nodded. "And the blood, and the documents, and Hale's empty grave?" Martin sighed, as if disappointed, but not surprised. "I suppose I knew this day would come. I just didn't expect it from you." "Who else?" Elian asked. "You left a trail, even if you didn't mean to." "That's the thing," Martin replied. "I meant to. I needed someone who could follow it, but only if they were smart enough not to die doing it." Elliot's jaw tightened. "Why? Why disappear? Why fake your death?" Martin looked up toward the broken roof, the light slanting down across his face. "Because I got too close, too curious. I uncovered a string of transactions that led to internal corruption, money laundering, evidence manipulation, property theft, and it went all the way up. I filed an inquiry. I was told to back off. When I didn't, they planned to clean house." Hale was the warning shot. "He came to me scared, told me they were watching both of us, and then one night, he vanished. His body never turned up because they never intended to let it be found. That's when I knew I was next." He stepped toward one of the crates, resting his hand lightly on it. "I had two options: die as a righteous man or survive as a compromised one. You chose to manipulate it from within. I built the fronts, the logistics routes, the burial certificates. I needed a network strong enough to hold secrets and smart enough to keep outsiders out. Once I was inside, I could redirect things, hide people like Hale, plant evidence against the real threats. Control the chaos. And kill Rourke," Elliot snapped. Martin looked at him calmly. "Rourke was unstable. He betrayed both sides. He kept records he wasn't supposed to. He reached out to you, didn't he?" Elliot didn't answer. Matt nodded anyway. That was his mistake. Elliot stepped forward, his hand near his holster but not drawing. "You think this ends with a reunion? You think I won't turn you in?" Martin smirked, a hollow expression. "No, I think you haven't decided yet, because you know the system I left behind is still in place, and if you expose me without unraveling the rest, it just adapts. You've seen it. Closed cases, staged burials, directed funds. I didn't invent it. I just survived it. That doesn't justify anything," Elliot said. "You let people die. You made my mother believe you were dead for 3 decades. Martin's eyes softened for the first time. "I never stopped thinking about her, or you. But this? This was bigger than one family. If I had stayed, we all would have died. I kept you safe. You built a machine," Elliot said bitterly, "a machine that hides truth behind money and casket." Martin stepped closer, and for a moment the warehouse felt smaller, as if all the years had collapsed into this one room. "You're right," he said, "but now you know where the gears are. You can dismantle them, or you can walk away." Elliot stared at him, at the man who had once tucked him in at night and taught him how to bait a fishing hook, now standing like a relic of a conspiracy built from lies and necessity. "I'm not you," he said. "No," Martin agreed, "but you're close." Somewhere outside, a door slammed against the wind. Both men turned sharply, instincts honed by different wars. Martin held up a hand. "You were followed?" Elliot shook his head. Not by anyone I invited. From behind the metal scaffolding, shadows moved. Boots crunched on gravel. A voice called out, firm and unfamiliar. Hands where we can see them bark of federal agents. His bait had worked too well. He'd triggered multiple surveillance flags, and now they were all here to watch the ghost resurface. Martin didn't flinch. He backed away slowly, hands half raised, but not in surrender. "Whatever happens next, you need to be smart," he said, eyes locking on Elliot's. "Don't let them write the end of this story. You've come too far." The moment the agents rushed in, Elliot raised his hand slowly, fingers spread. Martin didn't move, but his eyes tracked the silhouettes entering through the broken side panel of the warehouse, calculating, absorbing. Federal voices barked out orders, boots thundered against steel and concrete, and red beams from laser sights flicked across rusted crates and fractured glass. "This is Special Agent Morris with the Department of Internal Operations. Do not resist," one of them shouted. Martin stepped back further into the shadows, his expression unreadable. Elliot turned quickly, projecting calm. "He's unarmed," he called out. "He came to talk, that's all." "He's a fugitive," the lead agent snapped. "Weapon trained. We have sealed indictments, 27 sealed cases tied to the Ridge Park name, and enough evidence to bury this entire place in concrete." "You'll get your answers," Helen said firmly. "But he doesn't die here." Martin gave the faintest smirk, the edge of it tinged with something colder than amusement. "That's my son," he muttered. They cuffed him quietly, reading no rights, yet just silence and steel. Elliot rode back in a separate vehicle, alone with his thoughts. Back at the precinct, Martin was placed in a secure holding room with no windows and no clock. Elliot watched through the one-way glass as his father sat calmly, hands folded, not speaking. The man who had haunted his childhood was real now, flesh, breath, and blood, and behind the silence sat something deeper. Not shame, not regret, control. Hours later, when they finally let Elliot into the room, Martin didn't rise. He merely gestured to the seat across from him. "You've come to ask why," he said, tone casual, almost weary. Elliot sat, arms crossed. "Start with Hale." Martin exhaled slowly. Clarence was a good man, loyal, but too curious. When the money started moving through the evidence locker, he noticed gaps. He brought them to me, thinking I'd help him expose it. I tried to warn him, told him to back down. But he didn't, and the night we met in Hollow Pines, he wasn't alone. He paused, eyes drifting toward a blank wall. "They sent someone to watch us. When Hale realized it, he panicked, pulled his weapon. There was a struggle. I didn't shoot him, but I didn't stop it either." "So you let him die?" Elliot said coldly. Martin met his gaze. "I covered the scene, rewrote the report, buried what I could. If I hadn't, they would have buried me next." Elliot's jaw tensed. "And Rourke?" "Loose end. He kept records, names, dates, the same as you found. He was planning to sell them, maybe blackmail, maybe just guilt. Either way, he became a liability. I tried to warn him." "He wouldn't listen. So you staged a suicide?" Elliot snapped. Martin nodded. "How many deaths did you arrange?" 5 directly, Martin replied without blinking. "Another 8 I influenced. Redirected investigations, suppressed evidence, all to protect the structure. The system was already corrupted, Elliot. I didn't create it, I learned how to pilot it." "That doesn't make you better," Elliot said. "That makes you just as guilty." Martin leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "I kept you alive." Elliot's throat tightened. "You don't get to play martyr." "No," Martin agreed. "I get to offer you something better." He pulled a folded slip of paper from his coat pocket and slid it across the table. "Names, active players, people who are still inside. This is leverage. You can dismantle the machine or inherit it." Elliot didn't touch the paper. "You think I want what you built?" "I think you don't have a choice," Martin said. "You know you now. The moment you walked into Hollow Pines, you lit a signal. If you walk away, they'll come for you." "For your mother?" "You'd use her too?" Elliot growled. "I'm telling you to protect her. If you take this, you control what happens next." Elliot stood. "I'd rather burn it to the ground Back at his apartment, Elliot stripped off his gear, hands shaking from restraint. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. Then came the second call. This time he answered. A voice distorted, modulated. "You made a lot of noise, detective. That usually gets people hurt." The line went dead. He drove straight to his mother's house. It was dark, porch light on, her car in the driveway. He called her name twice. Dana opened the door, calm as always, but her eyes carried an edge of concern. "You've been followed," she said quietly. "How do you know?" he asked. She stepped aside, revealing the living room table. On it sat a black envelope. No name, no address, just 3 words typed on a white card. "Stay silent or bleed." Elliot's stomach clenched. He picked up the envelope with gloves, sliding the contents into an evidence bag. "Did you see anyone?" he asked. Dana shook her head. "But I heard the mailbox rattle around midnight." "I'll put a car outside," he said. "No," she answered. "They'll know you're scared. It's not fear," Haley said. "It's preparation." He returned to his apartment, dropped the evidence bag on the kitchen counter, and stared at the folded slip his father had passed across the table. He hadn't looked at it at the station, but now, with his mother's face still fresh in his mind, he opened it. 8 names, all familiar. A lieutenant still active in narcotics, a judge from circuit court, a medical examiner, 2 former internal affairs officers, all linked by dotted lines to Ridge Park, Oxbow, Mann & Co. They weren't just surviving in the shadows, they were thriving. And now they knew he was watching. By dawn, Elliot had packaged every scrap of intel, photocopies of sealed files, forensic scans from Hollow Pines, recorded statements, audio fragments from the warehouse, and a handwritten list from Martin into a secure, encrypted drive. He drove it personally to the Federal Office for Criminal Integrity in Eugene, walking it up to Special Agent Marcia Lang, who had previously worked on systemic corruption probes in New Mexico. She reviewed the data in silence, the corners of her mouth drawing tighter as each new document loaded on her screen. When she looked up, her expression was grim but decisive. "This is actionable," she said. "We'll move by morning." Elliot nodded once. He wasn't looking for thanks. Within 24 hours, federal arrest warrants were issued under the cloak of sealed proceedings. A 3-pronged operation launched simultaneously across 4 counties. Just after 6:00 a.m., SWAT teams moved on the homes of 2 senior officers still in active duty. Lieutenant Gerald Nunes and Deputy Chief Helen Saldana were taken into custody without resistance, both shocked to see the level of evidence brought against them. At 8:15, federal marshals picked up retired Circuit Judge Ronald Keyes at his estate in Bend, Oregon. By midday, former IA investigator Byron Latch was escorted out of a country club in Portland, mid-game. Simultaneously, agents seized Dr. Alan Vechner from his Arizona home, and within hours reports flooded in as the operation went public. 7 high-profile figures now in federal custody, indicted under RICO statutes for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and operating under the protection of a corrupt administrative structure. Local news outlets ran specials titled "Shadow in the Bag" and "Justice After Silence." Behind the scenes, Elliot reviewed live feeds and transcripts as the suspects were interrogated. None denied knowing Martin Ellroy, some admitted to past connections, others claimed plausible deniability, but all cracked under the weight of documentation. Thousands of falsified death records, dozens of staged autopsies, and laundering. Silver Grace Memorial was raided. Records dating back to 1992 were recovered from a fireproof basement safe, including one file labeled F-Man. Long-term holdings. Elliot recognized his father's alias instantly. While the country reeled from the revelations, one thread remained unsolved: Martin Ellroy. He was never formally transferred from the holding room after their last conversation. Somewhere between the internal lockdown and the shift change, the log sheet had been altered. His restraints were left unlocked, the cameras looped for 18 minutes, and the vehicle he was supposedly being transported in never reached the regional holding facility. Elliot stared at the footage frame by frame. The security logs had been overridden using credentials belonging to a deceased tech employee, a move that required high-level clearance and deep planning. By the evening, a national BOLO was issued under the name Martin Ellroy, alias Frederick Mann. News outlets ran his face across late-night broadcasts. Former detective at center of nationwide corruption scandal escapes federal custody. Some called him a whistleblower, others labeled him a domestic ghost, but to Elliot it was something else entirely. It was unfinished business. 3 days later, a traffic camera outside Kletzkani flagged a vehicle of interest, a light gray box truck exiting the service road near an abandoned shipping yard. The license plate was fake, but the make and model matched a fleet listed under Golden Valley Waste Solutions, a company Elliot knew to be one of Mann & Co.'s sister's registered subsidiaries. The footage was grainy, but showed the driver's profile for a brief second: gray hair, strong jawline, sunglasses. Elliot paused the frame and leaned in. It was enough. He pulled the truck's profile and traced all known GPS pings from the past 7 days. Nothing. It had been manually disconnected from standard telematics, likely reprogrammed with a false onboard log, but the direction was clear: westbound, away from Oregon, and deeper into less tracked wilderness, possibly toward the Idaho border or farther south. Elliot flagged the tag to inter-agency databases, but in his gut he knew Martin had planned this escape long before their confrontation. It was part of the architecture, the last card in a deck built to vanish. Back at his apartment, Elliot sifted through the remaining fragments of his father's world: stacks of maps, financial printouts, land leases, coded documents that had lost meaning without their creator to decode them. But one thing remained: a small sealed envelope marked, and aside, a hand-drawn map of what looked like a mining route with 3 dates and one phrase in Martin's handwriting: "When the ground shifts, follow the silence." Elliot stared at the line, unsure if it was a clue or a farewell. Federal agents now had enough to prosecute. Internal reviews began in 5 departments. Pensions were frozen, burial sites re-examined, a task force was formed to track systemic corruption in law enforcement management. But none of that brought Elliot closure. He could feel Martin's absence, like an unfinished chord, unresolved. Not out of reach, but still playing the long game. A ghost with too many shadows behind him. At his mother's house, Dana watched the coverage in silence. Elliot sat beside her, hand on hers. "He's gone again," she said softly. "This time by choice." "Last time too," Elliot replied. She didn't argue, as the camera feed from Kletzkani replayed again on the evening news. Elliot's eyes narrowed, not at the truck, but at a faint symbol painted on the rear panel. A triangle with 3 dots inside. He remembered it from a folder in the Hollow Pines bunker. A symbol for internal hierarchy, or warning, or both. Martin wasn't just fleeing, he was signaling something. The morning it ended was quiet. News came through an encrypted channel just before 7:00 a.m. A man traveling under the name Victor Mallon had been detained at a routine checkpoint near the Oregon-California border. He was driving a repurposed delivery van with outdated plates and a faded repair company logo stenciled on the side. The arresting officer had flagged the vehicle only because it didn't appear in the DMV's database. The man presented forged papers, soft-spoken and cooperative, but a routine fingerprint scan sent a silent ping across multiple federal systems. By the time the confirmation came back, the field agents already had him in custody. The match was undeniable. Martin Ellroy, fugitive, architect of an internal corruption empire, former father, former cop. The ghost in Elliot's life who had become flesh again. Elliot sat in the federal court gallery, flanked by agents and officials. As Martin was led in, wrists shackled, body thinner than the last time they'd met, but his posture still upright, still controlled. He wore a gray jumpsuit, clean-shaven, and said nothing. Not when the charges were read, not when the evidence was presented, not when his old badge, melted and charred, was held up by the prosecution as symbolic proof of the man he'd once pretended to be. Throughout the trial, he remained silent, his expression unreadable. Like a man watching a chess match he no longer needed to win. He never testified. He never requested leniency. When asked by the judge if he had any final statement before sentencing, he simply looked across the courtroom, his eyes briefly meeting Elliot's, and then said, "No, Your Honor." The trial had lasted 8 days. The deliberation took less than 6 hours. The evidence had been overwhelming, Banking records, signed death certificates, surveillance footage, witness testimony from retired co-conspirators, and Elliot's own detailed investigation outlining the path of Martin's deception. The courtroom was filled with reporters, federal observers, and families of those who had lost someone to the machine Martin had once helped run. When Elliot was called to the stand, he wore a plain black suit, no badge, no medals. Just the photo of him and Martin at Lake Grove tucked into his inside pocket, folded and worn. He spoke clearly, steadily, never raising his voice. "My father wasn't destroyed by the system," he told the court. "He made a choice to become part of it, to use its shadows instead of standing in the light. He believed manipulation was survival. That control without compromise, but control without conscience, is just power used for its own sake. I followed his trail for nearly 2 years, and every step revealed another lie, wrapped in reason. He did not vanish. He converted." When the sentence was read, life imprisonment without parole, Martin did not blink. The judge's voice was firm, condemning a career built on betrayal, a legacy of misdirection and harm masked as strategy. "This court finds the defendant responsible not only for the corruption of a public office, but for the willful erasure of truth, family, and justice," she said. "You will serve the rest of your life as a reminder that no system survives without accountability." After the hearing, Elliot exited through the back of the courthouse, away from cameras, away from the murmurs of the press. The sky was clear, the air cold but still. He didn't speak to the agents waiting by the vehicle. He simply walked. That evening he returned to his mother's house. Dana was in the kitchen peeling apples with the old paring knife she'd had since he was a child. She looked up when he entered, her eyes red but calm. "It's done," she said. He nodded. "He didn't say anything?" "Not a word." She exhaled, slow and long. "That sounds like him." They sat together at the kitchen table, the same spot where years ago Dana had once lied to a little boy about why his father wasn't coming home. On the table was a wooden box. Inside, Dana had placed the photo Elliot once found in Rourke's pocket, Martin Hale and the third man in front of the forest. She'd kept it all these years. He stared at the man in the center. He no longer saw a hero. He saw a survivor who made the wrong kind of peace with darkness. He slipped the photo into his own coat pocket, beside the one from Lake Grove. Later that night, Elliot walked the edge of his backyard, stopping beneath the string lights that still flickered from last fall. He closed his eyes and let the air fill his lungs. The weight of it all, the lies, the revelations, the chase, it didn't, but it settled. Solid, real. Truth wasn't closure, it was consequence. Back inside, he opened his drawer and took out the folded paper Martin had once given him, the list of names. Most of them were already behind bars. 1 or 2 were still under investigation, but Elliot didn't burn it. He filed it in a locked cabinet. A reminder that monsters aren't always strangers. Sometimes they are the men who taught you right from wrong, the ones who once tucked you in, the ones who chose the shadow because they feared the light. He looked once more at the photograph now framed on his desk. He no longer saw it as a memory. He saw it as evidence, proof that the people we love can become the very thing we swear to fight, and that loving them doesn't excuse them, just explains how much it hurts. If this story kept you hooked, consider subscribing to the channel for more intense narratives just like this one. Drop a like if you felt the weight of Elliot's journey. I'd love to know what moment shocked you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments below.